I want to talk for a moment about the hiring process and particularly how hiring decisions are made. Now, this video is intended for people who are good at getting interviews. They're getting first round or second round interviews, but they're having a hard time getting invited back to the late rounds of interviews. Or maybe they're consistently getting into the final interview, but they're not getting the job offer. If that's a phenomenon that you're familiar with, an experience that you're having, then this video is intended for you. So here's how the hiring process works in theory. You start with 100 candidates. You whittle them down to 20. Those 20 are reasonably qualified. You phone interview the 20 and you end up with 8. The 8 people are mostly qualified for the job. You bring in the 8 for first round interviews. You whittle it down by half again. You're into the second round of interviews, you're down to 4. And somewhere by the time you get to the third or the fourth round, you're down to 2 finalists. And then in theory, what happens is you got 2 people that are vying for the job in that last interview. They both come in for the final round. And then after all the interviews are done, all of the decision authorities, the hiring managers get together, the committee sits down and debates the 2 candidates and the pros and cons of each. And ultimately they come up with the optimal hire for that role for the company. That's how it works in theory. It sounds perfect in theory, but that's not how it works at all. Let me explain what's really happening. Usually by that last round of interviews, you've already got a pecking order established in terms of the various candidates. You don't have just 2 finalists. You usually have a favorite finalist who's usually kind of, the number 1 finalist. And then you have typically a number 2 finalist, somebody who's still very strong, but a good backup in case the top candidate doesn't work out. Now, what's happening, you get that stratification in the final interview because usually the hiring decision is starting to formulate itself. It's starting to forge itself in the middle of the interview process. After the first interview and during the second interview and during the third interview, we're starting to see the candidates stratify. They're starting to become favorites. A hiring manager very naturally, after meeting a candidate once or twice, is going to go, I really like that person. I can see them fitting into my team, or their experience is exactly what I need. You start to get a robust decision authority starting to come through and saying, I like that candidate best. Now, there's always a couple of candidates that are still very strong and kept in the process. But usually they're starting to stratify by the middle of the interview process. So if you're getting first round interviews, or second round interviews, but you're not being asked to come back for the late rounds, or conversely, if you're getting into the last round, but you're not able to convert the job offer, here's what's really happening. It's not because of something that you necessarily have or don't have in terms of credentials. It's usually based on the way that you're occurring in the process. People, for whatever reason, are concluding that you're not the right fit. You might not fit the manager's style of that group. You might not fit the team that's existing. You might not fit the customer base or interact well with the customers. Or maybe you're not, perception-wise, is that you're not going to get along with the senior management. Who knows? But usually if you're weeded out in the process, it really is something along the lines of how you're being perceived in terms of fitting or not fitting. It's not something in terms of your credentials. Now, this is what makes it a little bit weird and a little hard to understand, because if you got rejected after the third or fourth round, usually if you got any feedback at all, most of the times you don't get any feedback, but if you got any feedback, typically the feedback, whether it's from the recruiter or from the company directly, they're going to say that the other candidate that they chose had more experience in a particular area. They had more skill in a particular area or something. And so the company's going to justify the rationale for screening you out of the process based on a skill or an experience you didn't have. That might sound good, but in reality, they knew that you didn't have that experience probably from the very start of the process. They probably figured out that you didn't have that experience in the first round of interviews, but they still asked you to come back. And so when a company says that you got screened out because you don't have a particular skill set that some other candidate has, it's a red herring. It's not a lie. It's just that they've screened you out for usually something that has to do with chemistry and fit, not really about the technical nature of the role. Your job, if this is something that you're experiencing, your job is to figure out what you're doing in the interview process, what you're saying in your interviews, how you're saying it, how you're occurring to other people to make them conclude that you're not the right fit for the team. And it's likely something you don't even know you're doing, which is why it's really great to have a coach or somebody who can observe externally what's happening. So if you're having a hard time converting interviews into a final job offer, it usually has to do with something that you're doing in the interview process. And if that's the case, I want you to spend some time trying to figure that out. Really be vulnerable, really be open, and really allow yourself to receive feedback from a coach or anyone else to help you diagnose what might be happening. And only then can you be more confident going into the next set of interviews that you'll convert the job offer.